Welcome back, dear listener, or perhaps welcome for the very first time. You found your way once more to the fireside of the nighttime historian, where the noise of the world fades to hush, where shadows lengthen gently across the walls, and where the stories of ancient lives come to rest beside us like old friends. Before we begin tonight's story, why not take a moment to leave a comment and share where you're listening from? Whether it's a quiet bedroom in the city, a cottage by a winter coast, or a tent beneath desert stars, it's always a comfort to know where these stories are heard, and by whom. And if you find yourself returning to the fireside once in a while, perhaps subscribing to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy these whispers of history. Tonight we return once more to the heart of the ancient Persian world, to a realm of silence and ceremony, of stone walls that whisper, and of fire that never dies. This is not the Greece of legend, of speeches and statues and wrangling city-states, but a world of processions and watchful eyes, of sacred thresholds and royal stillness. Here, kings do not shout, they do not kneel, they speak in gesture and flame, and none bore that mantle more heavily, or more fatefully, than the man whose story we tell tonight. His name was Xerxes, known to his people as the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. To the empire he ruled, he was the steward of cosmic order, the protector of justice, the keeper of peace among 1,000 nations. To the lands he crossed, he was a shadow that fell like dusk over the sea, and to those who feared him, he became something else entirely. The Greeks called him a God-King, a tyrant, a monster clad in gold, but they did not understand what they saw. They did not know that in Persia, silence was power, and power was fire. He was no god. He was the bearer of flame, the son of two empires chosen not only by blood, but by the stars. So now, let your shoulders drop. Let the day fall slowly away behind you, and join us on this journey, past the fire temples and the royal roads, past the moonlit columns of Persepolis, into a chamber where ambrosia burns in golden braziers, where soft footsteps echo across polished stone, and where a man sits, very still, listening not to his courtiers, but to the voice of destiny. The sea was quiet, as if it, too, were holding its breath. The wind, usually wild along that broken spine of coast, softened beneath banners of embroidered gold. The tide shimmered like obsidian glass beneath the rising sun, and above it, the longest bridge the world had ever seen, stretched across the strait like a tether between continents, rope and plank, bound not just by rivets and cedar, but by the will of a single man. They say the crossing took 7 days and 7 nights, an endless procession of soldiers and beasts, wagons and cranes, artisans, priests, torch-bearers, and horses clad in woven armor. Every nation of the empire was there: Medes, Lydians, Bactrians, Ethiopians, Elamites, a river of humanity moving across water, pulled forward by duty, coin, fear, or prophecy. But not all crossed with footsteps. Some crossed in silence, watching from high above on a carved throne, carried by men chosen not for strength, but for steadiness. He did not speak. He did not need to. This was no campaign. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to history, and what it reflected was fire. Xerxes, son of Darius, grandson of Cyrus, was not the first to look westward with imperial eyes. He had inherited the maps, the oaths, and the wounds. His father had sent armies across the sea and watched them broken at Marathon. His grandfather had raised empires with mercy, law, and the promise that all peoples could live beneath a single sun. But Xerxes had inherited something more than vision. He had inherited failure. an empire too vast to ignore, and an insult too deep to forgive. Greece had defied Persia, and that defiance had been allowed to stand. Until now. The Greeks, in their sharp tongues and marble temples, would one day say he was mad, that he whipped the sea in fury, that he chained the waters with arrogance, but they did not understand the man, nor the moment. To Xerxes, the sea was not just water, it was chaos, drudge, that which defied order. In crossing it, he was not merely invading, he was sanctifying, fulfilling a ritual, binding rebellion beneath the weight of empire. The bridge was not only wood and rope, it was fire carried over darkness, Asher stretched across the unknown. And yet, even as the army crossed, even as prayers rose and drums thundered and war elephants groaned against the planks, something in the stillness of that morning gave pause. The sea did not move, the sky did not cry, the gods gave no sign, only silence. And perhaps, silence is the loudest omen of all. For in that moment, when east stepped into west, when order dared to tame the tide, the mirror held firm, but it would not hold forever. He was born in a palace that was not yet finished, a city of marble columns and raw stone that still echoed with the strike of chisels and the rhythm of wooden scaffolds. The air of Persepolis was always full of dust and fragrance, cedar resin and wet plaster, sandalwood smoke curling from bronze censers, and the metallic scent of tools that had not rested in years. From the moment Xerxes first opened his eyes, he was surrounded by creation, not just of buildings, but of empire itself. He would not remember the earliest years, of course, but others did. Servants would later whisper how, even as a toddler, he walked the long echoing halls with a silence that unsettled the guards, how he seemed to know which spaces were sacred, which altars not to touch. Some said he was born under a favorable constellation, a quiet fire lit from the blood of kings. He was the son of Darius the Great, and the grandson of Cyrus the Liberator, two names that even then weighed like gold on the tongue. But before he was Shahanshah, he was simply a boy, raised not in freedom, but in formation. The palace was his school, not a place of play, but of observation. Darius believed that greatness was not taught with words, but shaped with presence. He had no interest in raising a prince of charm or vanity. His son would walk the scaffolding with architects, listen to the daily readings of law, sit in silence beside priests during morning fire rites. And so Xerxes grew, tall, lean, quiet. He learned languages before he spoke them, learned gestures before he understood their meanings. Every corridor of the palace was a page, every guard, every scribe, every carved relief, a lesson. Darius himself was not warm, nor cruel. He was precise, a man who ruled with ink as much as iron. He had memorized the names of every satrap in the empire. He studied rainfall reports from Bactria, temple registers from Susa, grain yields from the Nile. At night, by lamplight, he drafted revisions to the law code in 3 languages. When Xerxes would ask about justice, Darius would unroll a tablet and point to an entry, not preach, not explain, but show. His rule was not merely power, it was process. And in this, Xerxes found both admiration and awe. Yet even within this world of men and empire, there was another presence, softer, more constant, Atossa. His mother did not stand at the center of things, but behind them, not invisible, but deliberate, like the gentle moonlight cast across a room of flickering lamps. She was the daughter of Cyrus himself, a woman who had once whispered counsel into the ears of kings. She rarely raised her voice, but her gaze carried weight. Xerxes, even as a child, felt the gravity of it. When he faltered in his studies, it was not his father's reprimand he feared. It was his mother's silence. She would simply sit beside him, eyes calm, until he corrected the mistake himself. In her private chambers, she kept scrolls and stories, some of lore, some of prophecy, but many of myth. It was there that Xerxes first heard the name Rostam, the great hero of old, born of the union between earth and divine spark. She spoke of his horse Raksh, of demons fought in hidden valleys, of the tragic duel with his own son. These were not fairy tales. They were mirrors, warnings, ideals, and in her voice even the most ancient story felt like a personal inheritance. Even Rostam, she would say, served a king, and later, softer, even kings serve something greater. Xerxes grew among these contrasts. His father was order, law, stone and scroll. His mother was memory, myth, silence, and star-born legacy. Between them, he walked the courts of Persepolis, absorbing their rhythms. He watched satraps from distant provinces arrive in robes of unfamiliar fabric, bringing tribute and petitions. He listened to disputes over irrigation, over temple rites, over the marriage rights of minor nobles. He memorized names. He learned the sacred scripts. He watched the priests stir flame at dawn, feeding it with dry sticks carved from aromatic wood, whispering hymns older than empire. Outside the palace walls, he could see the city rising. Rows of laborers carved steps into cliffs. Stonecutters pressed glyphs into lintels. Water carriers moved like veins through the scaffolding. He watched a mountain transformed, not with conquest, but with calculation. Every detail measured, every angle sanctified. His father did not just rule, he engraved. And all the while, the name Cyrus lingered like a fragrance that never faded. Stories of the great king echoed through court and household alike, of how he freed the oppressed in Babylon and offered sanctuary and dignity, of how he carved the rights of all people into stone, and of how he was beloved by both friend and former foe. He would hear of his death, far from home, in battle, some said, or in prophecy fulfilled. To some, he was the father of nations. To others, the eternal true king. But to Xerxes he was blood, and that blood pulsed in his temple whenever he walked alone beneath the columns of the Apadana, still unfinished but already eternal. Sometimes when the stars were low and the winds quiet, he would sit by the fire temple and wonder, not whether he would rule, but whether he would be remembered. And if so, as what? A builder, a restorer, a judge, a flame, or merely a name carved in someone else's tongue. In the final years of his reign, Darius the Great no longer walked the construction sites of Persepolis. He sat longer at court, rose more slowly from his throne, and spoke in fewer words. His mind, once a net stretched across the empire, catching news from the Nile, from the Indus, from the silver hills of Armenia, had narrowed its focus. It drifted always west, toward the sea, toward the small and fractured cities of a distant peninsula that had defied the word of empire and survived. By then, his accomplishments were beyond dispute. He had brought the satrapies of the East into the fold, extending Persian law to the Indus Valley, where merchants and priests had once governed by ancient custom. He had pushed the southern frontiers into Nubia, where Persian banners now flew over fortress towns at the edge of the cataracts. Egypt had been pacified and reorganized, its temples refurbished, its priests appeased with gold and grain. The royal road stretched without pause from Susa to Sardis, and the weight of tribute flowed back to Persepolis like blood returning to the heart. He had stamped his mark onto stone and law alike. And yet, for all that, there was one wound he could not close. Marathon. 10 years had passed since the Persian army was thrown back into the sea by a smaller force of Athenian hoplites. It had been a campaign planned without his direct command, delegated to generals who underestimated their enemy and overreached their supply lines. Still, the result was undeniable. Persia had lost. Darius had not forgotten, nor had the court. It was said, and often whispered when the king passed, that one of his servants had been tasked with a single sacred duty, to lean close once each day and murmur, "Remember Athens," not in mockery, in warning, a daily wound, preserved so that it would not become scar tissue. And for a time, that voice worked like a thorn behind the veil. It kept Darius sharp, kept his eyes on the west, and slowly, preparation began again. Xerxes was still a young man then, not yet declared heir, but already watching from the periphery of power. He saw his father meet with generals and shipwrights, engineers and diviners. Maps of Ionia were brought forth, weather scrolls translated from Phoenician mariners, messages from spies hidden among the Greek islands. The war had not ended. It had only retreated. But then, the silence deepened. Darius, strong even into his later years, began to falter. His hand, once steady when inscribing decrees in Elamite and Old Persian, began to tremble. The fire priests brought him omens, the entrails of sacrificed bulls showing no clear path. The stars flickered strangely in the western sky. And soon, murmurs of revolt reached the court. Egypt again stirring, Babylon preparing resistance. The king who had built so much now faced fragmentation. Xerxes watched it all unfold with a kind of stillness that had always defined him. He listened as his father debated whether to launch another campaign across the Aegean. He listened as governors argued over priorities, some urging caution, others whispering of glory. He watched his father's eyes grow dimmer, not from age, but from the weight of unfinished purpose. Then, without ceremony, the king fell ill. The court withdrew into whispers, and fire rituals were held daily at every temple in the capital. Salt was thrown over thresholds, prayers sent east, then west, but no god answered. Darius the Great, the lawgiver, the builder, the keeper of order, died before he could finish what he had begun. And so, the war did not end. It passed on, like inheritance. The courtiers already knew. The satraps began to shift their loyalties. The guards who had once bowed before Darius now turned, wordless, to Xerxes, and within a week his name was being carved onto tablets in Persepolis, King of Kings, Shahanshah, Steward of Asher. But with the crown came the echo, "Remember Athens," and with it, a silence that could not be refused. For the war was no longer strategy. It was expectation. It was gravity. To abandon it would be weakness. To ignore it, heresy. Even the omens, as ambiguous as they were, seemed to nod westward. Storms gathered over the sea. A comet was seen over Lydia. A fire altar in Susa burned blue for 9 days. The Magi said it was a sign. The priests said it was fate. The generals said it was time. But Xerxes was not his father's generals. He did not rush to war. He waited. Xerxes walked the unfinished halls of his father's palace and listened to the wind through pillars and the chants of priests in the great Apadana. He remembered the stories of Rostam and the bitter price of haste, and he asked himself, "Is this war truly mine?" But he already knew the answer. It had been laid before him in fire and in silence. It had been passed down not as an option, but as a burden carved in stone. And soon he would gather the council, and soon he would speak aloud the words all had been waiting to hear. But not yet. Not yet. The day the crown passed to Xerxes, no horns were blown, no crowds cried out. The courtiers didn't sing, and the city didn't erupt in joy. There were no chariots garlanded in blossoms or parades of gold-leafed elephants. There was only fire. At dawn, the priests lit the sacred flame atop the Tower of Silence. Unmoving and quiet, they watched. Below them, in the temple courtyard, the new king stood in stillness, robed in pure ivory white, as was custom for the ceremony of royal ascent. Beside him stood the Magi, silent as the stones, and beyond them, a circle of noble houses with their arms folded and heads bowed in reverence. And past even them, the world, waiting to see what kind of king would rise. The flame burned. It had been drawn from the altar in the temple of Susa, which itself had been kindled from the flame kept since the time of Cyrus. This wasn't a metaphor. It was the same fire, passed hand to hand across generations, guarded by priests who knew no sleep, fed with sacred wood and guarded from wind and ash. It was said that to let it die was to break the spine of the world, and now it waited, to be seen, to be accepted. When Xerxes stepped forward, he did not bow, he did not speak. He simply extended his hand, and the chief priest placed a pinch of ash into his palm, still warm. Xerxes raised it to his brow, and with that single gesture he became as a steward of the world's balance, the bearer of far, royal glory, the breath of Ahura Mazda made visible, the keeper of Asha, divine truth, cosmic order, the law beneath all laws. His war had not yet begun. His armies had not yet marched. But already he was consecrated. He did not speak often after that. At court he sat long in silence, listening to arguments and petitions, watching the movements of advisers as if studying patterns not yet clear. And when he did speak, it was brief, exacting, formal. Some said it was mourning, for his father, for his youth, for the peace that had ended. Others said it was calculation, but those closest to him knew better. They knew what silence meant in the house of fire. It was not absence. It was weight. To carry fire was not to glow with charisma or splendor. It was to burn without being consumed. It was to bear the gaze of heaven without blinking. Many had worn crowns. Few had borne flame. Xerxes was now among them. He had grown up surrounded by stories, not just of his father and grandfather, but of Yima and Feridun, of Khosrow and the legendary Jamshid, kings who walked the line between the seen and unseen. These were not distant myths. In Persia, the past was never far. It breathed through temples and echoed in council halls. A great king did not merely follow laws, he embodied them. He did not merely rule, he aligned the world. But what did it mean to align a world? Greece lay to the west like a jagged wound, defiant, disorderly, splintered. Its city-states bickered and schemed. They enslaved their own, tortured their young and devoured their neighbors, worshipped gods with the faces of men. From the eastern courts it looked like chaos made visible, a contradiction, a rebellion against the harmony Persia had offered. To the Greeks, war was politics. To Persia, war could be purification. Xerxes didn't even hunger for conquest. He didn't burn with wrath. He burned because it was his charge, to bear the flame, to bring Asha where chaos had festered, to restore not merely territory, but truth. And still, he waited. There were those in court who could not understand. Generals pounded their fists on scrolls, citing maps and logistics. Advisors spoke of tribute lost, of dignity unavenged. Merchants worried of disruption. Diplomats fretted over alliances. But Xerxes did not rise. He would rise when the fire said it was time. For now he studied the patterns of the stars. He listened to the rustling of priestly robes. He passed through his father's halls at night, fingers tracing the carved reliefs as if trying to read the future in stone. He sat beside his mother, Atossa, and listened once more to the old tales, not as stories, but as warnings. He offered prayers before the sacred fire and did not ask for victory. He asked only to be worthy. And one night, it was said, the fire in the Apadana temple flared blue and then white, and did not flicker for the span of a breath. The priests said nothing, but in the morning the court found Xerxes in full regalia, standing before the stone dais of kingship. The silence was over. The fire had spoken. From the high terraces of Persepolis, the world seemed to shimmer with order. It was a world of rhythm, a vast mosaic held together by the grace of symmetry. Languages flowed like tributaries into a single river of administration. Gods of many lands were honored in their own temples, but all bowed before Asha, the divine thread of truth and harmony. Roads were mapped to the stars, justice engraved for all, and the flame, the sacred fire that bound heaven to earth, never flickered, even in the wind. This was Persia's self-image, not a realm of conquest, but of alignment. Xerxes had inherited this vision through his lineage, through blood. He had watched his father receive delegations from India, Lydia, Libya, all kneeling in structured reverence. He had seen coinage minted in 20 scripts, robes woven in 20 styles, all sanctioned under one crown. And the farther one travelled across the empire, the more the design revealed itself, not through domination, but through continuity. A satrap in Sardis might speak a different language than one in Bactria, but their scrolls bore the same royal seal. Their fire altars burned with the same light. This was the empire's genius, to hold its differences in balance. And across the sea, there was none. The Hellenes were many, too many. City-states like scattered shards of a broken dish. They warred with each other, made treaties that lasted weeks, overthrew kings only to install tyrants. Corinth fought with Athens. Athens schemed against Thebes. Thebes plotted against Delphi. And Sparta made war not just against foreigners, but against its own. To Persian eyes, it was all noise. Xerxes had read the reports. He had listened to Ionian governors explain the strange customs of the Greeks, their obsession with individual pride, their refusal to kneel, their chaotic assemblies. He had heard of how they elevated athletes to gods and poets, to prophets, how they let merchants dictate politics. He had heard of their loud temples, full of chanting and challenge. It was not just strange, but unstable, unanchored. And then there was Sparta. Where Persian kings ruled by divine mandate, Spartan children were inspected at birth and discarded if imperfect. Where the Persian court valued silence and discipline in the service of peace, Sparta trained its youth to kill by stealth, to steal, to starve, to obey without thought. The Spartans enslaved entire populations, the Helots, who were forced to farm, serve, and die without name or honor. Each year, it was said, the Spartan state declared formal war on its own Helot class, granting its citizens legal license to murder them in the streets. This, to Xerxes, was not valor but savagery, and yet these same men called his people tyrants. Let the Greeks sing of liberty. What freedom lived in constant strife? What liberty was found in lashing one's own sons into soldiers, or building cities on the backs of slaves who could not speak? Persia offered roads, granaries, temples, law. Persia offered dignity, even to the conquered. In the empire, a man could pray to his own gods, speak his own tongue, wear his own robes, as long as he paid tribute and respected the cosmic order. It was not weakness, it was wisdom. And now that wisdom stood at the water's edge, staring into its reflection. The Greeks had not merely defied Persia, they had insulted the mirror. They had refused alignment, and for this the fire of Xerxes burned, with purpose. The world had to be made whole, of course, and wholeness could not be begged for. It had to be taken. Some say he stood at the cliffs of the western shore and looked out toward that correction, not as a warlord preparing to destroy, but as a physician preparing to set a broken bone. The wound of Marathon still wept, and beyond it, the infection of disorder spread. He would not bring death for its own sake. He would bring silence, sacred, measured, luminous. He would bring a flame the Greeks had never seen and could never understand. And when he stepped back from the cliff's edge, the wind behind him bowed. Across the empire, the air carried different scents. In Sardis, it was thick with olive brine and wet marble. In Babylon, it swirled with frankincense and the sharp edge of sun-baked brick. In Bactria, the wind came down cold from the mountains, smelling of pine resin and smoke-cured wool. But all these places, distant as they were, answered to the same center. The Persian Empire was not a single note held long, but 1,000 threads woven and perfected by Cyrus and Darius, moving in rhythm. Kingdoms, satrapies, river valleys and deserts, each speaking its own tongue, honoring its own gods, following laws drawn from ancient soil. And yet, they belonged to something greater than themselves. A satrap in Egypt might dress in linen and speak the tongue of pharaohs. He would govern according to regional custom, oversee temple rites older than the empire itself, and correspond with priests who still whispered the names of Osiris and Ra. But his letters to Persepolis would be written in Aramaic, the shared script of empire. His ledgers would match a standard of weights agreed upon across the satrapies, and when couriers from the capital arrived, they would be housed, fed, and honored. This was what Xerxes inherited, not a people, but a pattern. And the pattern orchestrated its differences. Governors were drawn from both noble Persian families and local dynasties. Law codes were translated, not replaced, and judges might rule in the language of the people, but their decisions were carved in the tongue of kings. A merchant could ride from Ecbatana to Tyre and never fear the loss of protection. He would pass inns built at royal expense, drink water from stone wells, and carry seals that guaranteed his contracts. The empire offered more than safety. It offered structure, and yet beneath that structure pulsed something deeper, a principle, a word that appeared in temple hymns, legal decrees, and royal inscriptions alike. Asha. Order, yes, but more than that, it was about truth and justice, a balance between the many and the one. For Xerxes, raised within this design, diversity was never an obstacle. It was the point. Harmony, after all, required multiple voices. He had seen how satraps brought not only tribute, but news, of famines, of floods, of border tensions and harvest feasts. He had watched his father treat each satrapy not as a conquered land, but as a stewarded province. Their prosperity strengthened the throne, their sorrow weakened it. And from this, Xerxes drew a lesson not often understood by his rivals across the sea, that power sustained through fear is brittle, but power sustained through respect is enduring. In court, translators stood behind every column, their robes marked by thread color, their speech quick and low. Food was served from many traditions, lentils from Elam, honeyed almonds from Sogdia, pickled garlic from Lydia. Even music had travelled, lutes tuned to the scales of Parthia, flutes carved from the reeds of the Nile. The palace at Susa mirrored the one at Persepolis in layout, in reliefs, in the spacing between flame altars. The king's seal was recognized in valleys where his name was never spoken aloud, but where his justice was trusted. This balance did not come without labor. Administrators kept vast records of taxation, of temple inventories, of military obligations. Roads were patrolled, temples were consulted. From each satrapy came petitions, some for water rights, some for trade disputes, some asking for royal arbitration when old laws clashed with new needs. Xerxes read many of them himself, even after his ascension, not out of vanity, but because the king was more than a ruler. He was the final hinge in a door made from many woods. And when he stood before the map of empire, carved into polished stone, each satrapy inlaid with precious metals, he did not see possession. He saw promise. This was not conquest. This was continuity. Persia's greatness lay not in how it spread, but in how it held. This was the machine Darius had built. Part road, part ritual, part resolve. And when Xerxes took the throne, he started to refine it. Starting with appointments, inspectors were reassigned, some replaced. Governors who had grown complacent in their provinces were called east for review, and a handful returned to their posts. Many didn't. In their place came younger men, some born of Persian blood, others drawn from the border satrapies, where loyalty was proven not by lineage, but by record. Reports became more frequent, edicts more tightly worded. Audits extended beyond tribute to include grain reserves, temple inventories, and the number of healthy oxen in state herds. This was calibration without vengeance. Where Darius had etched a vast system of law across stone and scroll, Xerxes focused on its temperature. Where judgment lagged, he replaced scribes. Where roads wore down, he levied taxes for stone resurfacing. When a region delayed its tribute by more than a moon's cycle, he dispatched envoys with both parchment and spear. Those who complied were commended. Those who stalled were not. But he also understood the virtue of visibility. Xerxes, in his early reign, chose movement. Within the first 5 years, he held court not just in Persepolis, but in Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana. Local officials were summoned and calendars were reviewed. Zoroastrian rites were performed publicly, and alignment was no longer passive. It required demonstration, and with that shift came something deeper, the slow tightening of spiritual expectation. Under Cyrus, the empire had offered a wide berth to the gods of many lands. Under Darius, Zoroastrian thought had entered law, but remained flexible. Under Xerxes, however, flexibility began to narrow. The central temples in Susa and Persepolis saw increased funding. High magi were assigned to monitor regional practices. Festivals for Ahura Mazda grew in length and importance. Temple lands that had once operated independently were now brought under royal oversight. It was not persecution, not yet, but it was a signal. The fire at the center had grown hotter, and this shift would not go unnoticed. Among the first to bristle were the priesthoods of Babylon, of course, where Marduk's temple still held court over calendars, coronations, and civic time. For generations, the kings of Persia had paid ceremonial homage to Marduk as king of the gods, preserving the sacred fiction that Babylon's divine order remained intact. But Xerxes, in a decision that echoed far beyond priestly halls, declined the right. No clay tablet bears his voice explaining why, but the message was clear. There would be no more gods above the king. There would be only one fire, and it would burn in the language of Persia. In the bureaucracies, this shift took material form. Tax documents began to list religious exemptions with stricter qualifiers. Priestly ranks, once managed locally, now reported through satrap-appointed intermediaries. In Egypt, the temple granaries were inspected not by priests, but by royal registrars. In Lydia, inscriptions began to name Ahura Mazda alongside traditional deities, then eventually without them. Some within the court whispered of risk, others of renewal. Xerxes listened to both, but his pen moved forward. Where Cyrus had built the road and Darius had laid its stones, Xerxes began to tighten the path's walls. There was no rupture or proclamation, only policy, measured, repeatable, scalable. And to most subjects, the empire continued unchanged. Their local magistrates answered their petitions. The royal road still flowed, and the grain still came. But for those who listened closely, in the court archives, in the tax codes, in the temple accounts, something new was stirring. The machine was still humming, but now it was tuned. The scroll arrived sealed in black wax. It was brought to Susa by a sleep-deprived rider. His horse foamed at the mouth. His hands were blistered where the reins had pulled. The message was terse and urgent. A fragment of breath carved into parchment. Babylon has risen. The words hung in the council chamber like dust in torchlight. No one moved. No one whispered. Babylon. Not a border province. Not a rebellious tribe. Babylon. The old heart. The axis around which past empires had once turned. The city of gates and omens, of astronomers and ritual time. For centuries it had been respected as sacred, not for its loyalty, but for its gravity. That gravity was shifting. The first revolt came quiet and sudden, a bloodless usurpation. A claimant declared himself king in the temple square, invoking ancient titles, son of Nabonidus, chosen of Marduk, and the people bowed. Priests from the Esagila temple performed the coronation rite, as if it were a festival long delayed. Drums beat, incense burned. The rebels closed the gates with ceremony and celebration. When news reached Xerxes, he read the scroll twice, then set it aside. No one knows what he said, but messengers were dispatched immediately, not to negotiate, to surround. The city would stand no chance to his force. The siege was swift and short. The walls were breached with the betrayal. Xerxes ordered the self-declared king paraded through the city in chains, but not executed in public. His death was quiet and in humiliation. The city was spared fire for a time. It was believed the moment had passed. But Babylon had not finished its derangement. Less than 2 years later, another rebellion rose, louder, bolder, bloodier. This time, the resistance spilled into the surrounding regions. Temples raised again their banners. Petitions arrived from loyal provinces, warning of intercepted correspondence, missing tributes, magi threatened or turned. It was the voice of an older world refusing to kneel. And now, Xerxes responded with consequence. The statue of Marduk, The golden god carried through the city at New Year to bless the cycle of time was taken from its temple, like a lung pulled from a body, but left whole. It was placed in a secure vault under imperial guard, and the temple was shuttered. Without the statue, no king could be crowned in the old rite. Without the rite, no king could claim divine legitimacy in Babylon. The calendar itself collapsed. Festivals lost their anchor, and sacred processions halted mid-stride. Priests stood before empty pedestals and asked no questions. They already understood the answer, and so Babylon did not burn, it faded. Xerxes issued no grand declaration, but the act spoke louder than any decree. The city's special status, long protected since the time of Cyrus, was revoked. Its priesthoods no longer enjoyed exemption from imperial review. Land charters were reissued, and temple holdings were audited. New governors were appointed from outside the region, administrators who spoke Elamite, not Akkadian. The clocks of Babylon were no longer the heartbeat of empire. They were echoes in a sealed chamber. Within court circles, this was called alignment. But in the eastern satrapies, it felt like gravity itself had shifted. The empire had always held its religions like threads in a vast tapestry, some tight, some loose. But now the threads were being trimmed. Whispers returned. Cyrus would not have done this. But they were soft and far from the throne. To Xerxes, the rebellion was not simply disloyalty. It was fracture, a refusal to match rhythm. The empire was a system, a structure, a language of motion and mirrored duties. When one node refused to resonate, it endangered the whole. Harmony was not indulgence. It was discipline. And in Babylon, discipline had broken. So the correction came, measured and permanent. Some historians later said this was the moment the Persian heart grew hard, that from here on, tolerance gave way to order. Others said it was always inevitable, that the ideals of Cyrus were never more than myth, and that every empire must choose between breadth and control. But in the temple of I.ii, where no chants rose and no candles were lit, the air grew still. And somewhere deep beneath the stone corridors of Susa, in a chamber lined with ledgers and royal seals, a new kind of empire was being born, one whose breath no longer adjusted to others, but expected the world to inhale on cue. The name of Cyrus was carved into the bones of empire. But empires shift. What had once been wisdom, pluralism, tolerance, deference to sacred geography, had become a liability. Too many rights, too many voices, too many calendars ticking out of rhythm. Cyrus had ruled a newborn realm, still malleable, still in need of gentleness. Xerxes inherited a machine, vast, intricate, powerful, and machines do not bend without consequence. In the early years of his reign, he still invoked Cyrus in proclamations, still adorned palace inscriptions with the lineage of liberators. But in private, among advisors and magi, the tone had changed. They spoke of Cyrus as first light, glorious, yes, but too soft. The world now demanded a sharper sun, and so the memory of Cyrus became less a mirror, and more a compass, a direction, not a destination. To the west, the contrast was sharp. The Greeks remembered Cyrus too, some with grudging respect, but they did not understand what he had become in Persian eyes. They saw him as the exception, not the origin. In Athens, where the agora bustled and philosophers argued beneath shaded porticos, they imagined Cyrus as a break in the line of tyrants. They whispered, with misplaced confidence, that perhaps Persia had once been noble, before the rot set in. But the Greeks mistook plurality for permission. What they called freedom, the Persians now saw as fragmentation, and Xerxes saw it as refusal. The laws of Cyrus had offered sanctuary. Xerxes offered structure. Where Cyrus had made space, Xerxes began to shape, not to destroy difference, but to align it, to press it into form. And yet, the echoes never fully faded. In his private moments, beneath the stone canopy of the Apadana, or along the shaded courtyards of Susa, Xerxes still felt the shadow of the old king walking beside him. Not with reproach, but with distance. As though Cyrus lived in a different climate of rule, a different era of belief. Sometimes when reviewing petitions from Babylon or letters from Egypt, he would hesitate, just slightly, before signing his seal. He would recall how Cyrus walked through gates unarmed, how he rode beside Babylonian priests rather than above them. But then he would set the seal anyway, not with fury, not with doubt, simply with necessity. Cyrus had planted the garden, but it was Xerxes who now had to prune it, lest the vines pull down the walls. The great hall did not echo. That was its first lesson, even as hundreds passed beneath its lintels, guards in lacquered bronze, scribes with scrolls, emissaries in linen robes dusted from desert wind. The hall of 100 columns swallowed sound, like a temple swallows incense. Voices dropped, footsteps softened. The air shifted not with speech, but with movement, small, deliberate, precise. For here every line was measured, every shadow cast with intention. This was not merely a palace, it was a scripture carved in stone. Persepolis had been built to explain the world. Its gates, adorned with creatures of composite myth, lion, eagle, bull, were proclamations, symbols of watchfulness, strength, endurance. Its platforms were aligned to solstice and equinox, tracing the breath of heaven through sun and season. The reliefs along its stairways depicted no scenes of conquest, no screaming captives or broken swords. Instead they showed procession, satraps from every corner of the empire bringing gifts, delegations clad in their own attire, crowned in their own customs, all arriving in harmony. There were no chains or bowed heads, only symmetry, only rhythm, only order. The inscriptions beneath these scenes were carved in 3 tongues, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, each language a key and each key a signal. Here, all could read the truth of the throne. I am Xerxes, King of Kings, son of Darius, chosen by Ahura Mazda. Nothing more, just lineage, title, and alignment. The text was not to be admired, it was to be understood, like the flame that burned in the temple just beyond the hall, tended by robed priests, never extinguished, never unattended. The palace declared its purpose through consistency. Xerxes understood this design intimately. He had walked these halls as a boy, watched artisans angle each relief so the morning light would kiss the figures just so. He knew which colonnade was aligned to the new year, which arch cast its shadow over the fire altar on the day of Cyrus's coronation. The palace did not merely house the empire, it enacted it. Where Greece built theatres to question power, Persepolis was itself a stage, not of drama, but of affirmation. Its performances were in gesture, in pause, in gaze. A slight incline of the head could carry the weight of a verdict. A missed step in protocol could end a career. Even the way the light pooled beneath the stone lions at dusk felt deliberate, as if the builders had shaped not just stone, but time itself. And so each day the rituals resumed. Each morning the flame was fed. Each evening the records were sealed with wax and signet. And across the columns in the shifting light the empire stood, not by sword or song, but by shape, by space, by stone, by the palace that spoke without words. The system had been tuned. The couriers ran their routes, the flame altars stayed lit, the coinage bore its face, and in the stone silence of Persepolis, all appeared aligned. But systems, no matter how precise, do not quiet the weight of inheritance, nor do they still the horizon. For even as Babylon fell into ritual stillness, and the temple records began to reflect the king's design, a different rhythm stirred, older than tribute, louder than policy. In the western satrapies, the names were spoken again. Marathon, Eretria, Athens, names that had once been carved in pain, now pulsed like unhealed wounds in the council scrolls, and they did not fade. Xerxes had reshaped the empire, yes, but not the echo that followed him. It walked with him through ceremony. It watched him through the veils of incense. It curled at the edge of every fire. The Greeks had defied order, and though Persia moved forward, the defiance remained like a breath held too long in the chest of empire. The priests offered no counsel. The magi marked their calendars. The generals stood ready, and the sea waited. The defeat at Marathon remained in the records, in the war scrolls shelved behind locked panels, and in the tone of court advisors who measured every mention of Greece with caution. Troop reports shifted westward, grain stockpiles in Lydia increased, coastal watchtowers were reinforced. Nothing was announced, yet preparations spread through the empire with quiet precision. Xerxes observed the changes. Phoenician shipwrights arrived earlier than expected. Royal engineers redrew fortification maps for Sardis. The royal road carried orders eastward toward Sogdia and Parthia. Satraps along the Aegean fortified their holdings. Inland routes were cleared for faster movement of troops and timber. Across the court, momentum replaced debate. The magi held longer rites at dawn. Flame altars burned high at midday. A comet was seen above the western sky, and the temple guardians recorded its path without interpretation. The omens continued. In the sanctuary at Susa, the sacred fire remained steady when it should have dipped with the morning winds. The high priest performed additional offerings. There were no conclusions spoken aloud, only repetition. And repetition meant certainty. Xerxes convened his generals. He reviewed the Marathon campaign through older scrolls copied from his father's archive. His attention stayed on supply errors and landing formations. Officers discussed passage points along Thrace and the naval routes through the Cyclades. Engineers proposed the scale of the bridge across the Hellespont and the materials required to bind it. The council assembled in full 2 days later. Xerxes issued the command. The empire would cross into Greece. Orders moved by nightfall. In Sardis, a new grain depot was commissioned. Shipyards along the coast doubled their workforce. The canal at Mount Athos appeared again in draft form on engineers' tablets. Couriers left Persepolis carrying military timetables and inspection routes. Tribute records were adjusted to fund the provisioning of a continental campaign. Satraps began conscription measures in accordance with established quotas. The war did not begin with a battle. It began with coordination. Xerxes set the plan in motion early. Orders were dispatched to the satrapies. Engineers, shipwrights, and road teams were mobilized across the empire. In Lydia and Caria, trees were cut and shaped for planks. Supply lines were redrawn. Old roads were cleared, and relay stations reactivated. The campaign would not move in haste. It would move in precision. At Mount Athos, Persian engineers reopened work on the canal once abandoned by Darius. This time, they succeeded. A narrow channel was carved through the peninsula, wide enough for ships to pass without risk. It took months, but when complete, supply vessels moved through safely under guard. To the north, preparations began at the Hellespont. The army would not sail across. It would walk. 2 bridges were built using hundreds of ships, lashed together and secured with chains. Decking was laid across the top. The bridges reached from Asia to Europe in a line wide enough for men and carts to cross side by side. The army gathered in phases. Infantry and cavalry moved west from Persia. Supply wagons followed in long caravans. Oxen and horses were cycled for rest. Archers, engineers, and drivers were assigned by region. Every satrapy sent men, arms, and tribute, not just to fight, but to be seen. The empire was showing its weight. At Susa, the court held ceremonies for divine alignment. Prayers were offered. Names of participating provinces were read aloud. Fires were carried west, guarded and kept lit. This was not just a military campaign. It was ritual. Xerxes tracked progress through scrolls delivered daily. The bridges held. The roads were secure. The canal passed its tests. When the season turned, the first soldiers crossed into Europe. By the time Xerxes arrived, the way was open. There was no clash, no drama. The empire had crossed water without a fight. The sea had not been conquered, it had been used. The bridges were in place. The canal was flowing. The roads were active day and night. But before the full weight of the army moved, the world around Persia began to stir. Envoys from Babylon, Ionia, and Lydia moved through the courts of Susa and Sardis. Some came offering tribute. Others asked questions without asking them, about the scale of the army, about the timing of its movement. Greek cities under Persian rule sent observers in quiet caravans, posing as merchants or pilgrims. Even across the Aegean, word spread that the Shahanshah was preparing something larger than a campaign. It was an enterprise, a reckoning. The great cities of the empire had already begun to shift their posture. Susa held mourning ceremonies twice as long. In Babylon, the temple officials took no chances. Public rituals increased, but so did private meetings with visiting Persian officers. Egypt sent another shipment of grain northward, a gesture of loyalty that required no explanation. Everyone understood what was coming. Spies from Athens and Sparta watched from across the sea. They gathered details from Ionian ports, noting the frequency of troop movement, the markings on armor, the colors of standards. Some returned, others didn't. The information they carried wasn't new. Persia was preparing for war. But the scale exceeded every assumption. One message read simply, "They come with the earth." In Persepolis, the king stayed still. He listened to every report, accepted every scroll. His instructions came sparingly but always on time. Satraps were summoned to review regional readiness. Officers submitted projections for march speed and coastal fortification. There were no delays. The empire moved on schedule. The omens continued. A second comet was seen, and priests reported unusual wind patterns over Cappadocia. In Sardis, a goat was born with 2 tongues, recorded and burned in offering. This was the last stillness before the crossing. The army had not yet left the continent in full, but the outcome had already begun to pull in smaller states, hesitant kings and rival temples. The empire was no longer preparing alone. The world was watching. The order to move came just before dawn. The first units were already packed and ready. Cavalry units from Bactria and Sogdia moved out first, their horses blanketed in scaled leather, their lances tipped with bronze. Behind them, Engineers and bridge crews rechecked the fastenings, inspecting ropes, seals, and anchor chains before each group crossed. No one spoke unless necessary. Then the storm came. The sky turned fast. Gusts blew in from the north, churning the water into uneven swells. One of the pontoon bridges groaned under pressure. Then it twisted. A connecting beam cracked. Within minutes the structure began to come apart. Ships slammed against each other. Ropes tore loose. Entire planks disappeared beneath the current. Engineers scrambled to pull back crews. One unit fell into the water and didn't return. The western span was gone. Men were pulled out, shaking, soaked, some wounded. Reports reached the king's tent before the rain had even stopped. Xerxes didn't flinch. He called for the magi and the engineers together, one to sanctify, the other to rebuild. Construction restarted before nightfall. Hundreds of fresh ships were brought in from nearby harbors. Local labor teams were assigned to row, haul, and weld chain. Timber arrived from the forests behind Abydos. Nails, bolts, and ore assemblies were pulled from emergency stores. This time, the bridge would hold. While the builders worked, the soldiers reorganized. Marching orders were adjusted. Archery divisions rotated to night drills. Cavalry herds were moved uphill to prevent trampling the wet roads. Grain stores were sealed in tar cloth. Nothing was wasted. By the third day, both spans were ready again. This time, the chains were doubled. Each junction was reinforced with iron clamps. Platforms were inspected one by one, and by dusk, the first regiment began the crossing. Xerxes mounted and led the first royal column himself. Behind him came the immortals, elite guards in patterned scale armor, shields strapped tight, their eyes forward. Torchbearers followed on foot, their flames protected by glass domes. The bridge creaked, but held. From the eastern shore, it looked like a city crossing the sea. Couriers moved along the flanks, relaying messages to units on both sides. Supply carts rolled over in rows of 10. Elephants passed at night, each footstep timed by handlers to keep the platform steady. Every half-day, horns signaled the next division to proceed. The flow never stopped. By the end of the week, the empire had entered Europe. The cliffs were narrow and steep. Salt wind scraped the granite, and the pass twisted like a blade between the mountains and the sea. This was Thermopylae, the hot gates, where steam from buried springs curled into the air and stone paths echoed with the tread of boots. The Persians arrived in formation, archers, engineers, infantry, cavalry, a line that moved without pause or sound. They set up camps in stages. Tents rose in the foothills. Cook fires glowed behind earthen mounds. Surveyors took note of elevation. The king's tent stood at the rear, guarded by immortals in scale armor and soft boots. No speeches, no flare of triumph. Just movement, measured and exact. At the front, Greek scouts had already sent word south. Leonidas of Sparta had taken position at the pass with a band of allies, Thespians, Thebans, and the famed 300. But these men were not alone. Thousands had marched with them. Many would leave before the end. The myth, built later, would reduce it to a stand of heroes. But the truth was more tangled. The Greek alliance was fragile. Arguments cracked their councils. The Spartans had delayed even joining the defense, bound by festival rites, reluctant to move without signs from their gods. But when they came in silence. Their slaves, the helots, carried their supplies. Their younger squires bore their arms. These were not warriors of freedom, but of discipline bred through fear. Xerxes gave the order to wait. For 2 days, he allowed the Greeks to reconsider. Envoys approached under flags of parley. They were dismissed without reply. On the 3rd morning, drums sounded behind Persian lines. Arrows were stacked in barrels. Infantry were issued ration stones. The sea behind them shimmered with transports, and when the assault began, it was with calculation, not fury. The first wave was light, a test. The second, stronger. Spartans fought with short swords and overlapping shields, driving back wave after wave. But the pass choked their strength. Their discipline worked in the narrow terrain, yet even then, they bled. The Persians rotated troops. Where one unit failed, another replaced it. The Medes pressed, the Sacae circled. The Immortals were sent, elite, masked, swift. Even they could not break the line. For a moment the Greeks held. Songs would be written about that resistance. But songs do not measure the war. They do not show the scouts who betrayed the path behind the ridge, a hidden goat trail that curved above the pass. Nor do they tell of the gold paid for that betrayal. Ephialtes, the name would later be cursed. But Xerxes did not curse. He listened. He marked the map. He sent men by night. At dawn the flanking force emerged. Greek sentries cried out. Leonidas had been warned. A few stayed behind to cover the retreat. What followed was slaughter. The Spartans died, yes, and with courage. But courage does not erase cruelty. These were men raised to kill without pity. From youth they were taught to starve, to steal, to lash others to prove strength. Each year they declared ritual war on their own enslaved people. Each victory was born from pain. The Persians did not admire them. They respected the resistance, but pitied the culture. Their own empire held nations together by oath and coin, not chain and knife. At Thermopylae, they saw men who had been turned into weapons, not citizens. When the final blow came, it was not with spite, it was with necessity. The pass opened. The path to Athens lay ahead. The dead were burned or buried. The helots were left behind, uncounted. Later, Greek poets would forge the tale into a monument. 300 against the world, a stand for liberty. But liberty does not bloom in blood-soaked soil. The fire that passed through the hot gates did not seek vengeance. It sought passage. The war had not ended. It had just begun. The streets of Athens were empty. Doors hung open and pots lay overturned in the dust. From the Acropolis to the Agora, the city had been abandoned with bitter calculation. The Athenians had taken to the sea, their people scattered across nearby islands, their navy regrouping for what they hoped would be a stand. They had chosen resistance over surrender, and now their city waited. Xerxes entered without celebration, and the army flowed in behind him, organized, focused. Engineers marked the temple foundations, and infantry secured the high ground. His advisors offered words of caution, but the king gave none in return. He stood before the great temple of Athena, columns bare in the rising heat, its statues draped in the shadows of late summer. No priest met him and no offering was left behind, only stone and memory. He gave the signal. Oil was poured at the foot of the steps. Wood was stacked. The fire spread quickly, crawling along marble and timber, turning color to ash. A second signal. Another temple. Then a third. Flames climbed into the morning sky, lifting with the wind. The Acropolis glowed as embers bled into daylight. The roar of burning oak replaced the silence of prayers. He watched it all, unmoving. There had once been a man in his father's court, a servant, older than most and half blind but always present. Each day he whispered the same words into Darius's ear. Remember Athens. a ritual of grief, a tether to the wound of Marathon. That man was gone now, and his duty complete. The memory had been answered. No one spoke of vengeance, no decree used the word, but all understood. Athens had challenged the order of empire, and it had mocked Persian strength, spilled Persian blood, rejected Persian peace. What stood now was not merely a city, it was a symbol of refusal, and symbols can burn brighter than fire temples. Xerxes didn't linger. Once the fires had finished their work, he turned back toward the sea. His orders were clear. Let the ruins stand. Let no new building rise in their place. Let the smoke be seen from every ship, every coastal village, every Greek eye still watching from across the gulf. The message was carved in heat and shadow, a reckoning carried out with full clarity. The Persians did not gloat. They did not desecrate the dead, but they did not weep either. They moved through the city as they would through any site of judgment, with purpose. The temples cracked, the altars failed, and the city that had once claimed to birth democracy now knelt before consequence. In the dust that followed, some say a single voice was heard, an old captain speaking quietly to a younger soldier. Why not take it? And the answer came. We came for fire, not for stone. That day, Persia did not occupy Athens. It reminded it that empire does not forget. The Persian fleet gathered in strength along the coast near Salamis, spread like polished scales across the gulf. Hundreds of ships, Phoenician, Egyptian, Cilician, Ionian, lined the water in careful order. Their prows bore animal heads, their sails curled like leaves in the still air. The invasion had moved faster than any Greek had expected. The Peloponnesian cities bickered as usual. Some wanted to abandon Athens entirely. Others begged for reinforcements. Themistocles, sharp-eyed, desperate and theatrical, had gambled everything on a narrow strait. The Persian command knew the Athenians had retreated to Salamis. Their fleet was cornered. Most expected the final blow to come quickly, but not all agreed. Artemisia, queen of Halicarnassus and commander of 5 ships, urged caution. She warned that the Greeks had nowhere left to run, and that desperation could make them dangerous. Her voice was rare in court, but respected. Even Xerxes listened when she spoke, yet the advice was set aside. Some saw it as hesitation. Others assumed victory was already assured. Xerxes took his place on a hillside above the coast. A platform was built for him. From there, he could watch the engagement unfold. He was not there to command tactics, that was left to his admirals, but he would witness the culmination of years of planning. At first, everything moved as expected. The Persian fleet entered the straits, confident in numbers. The Greeks, huddled behind their smaller, more agile triremes, waited until the tide turned and struck. It happened quickly. Too quickly. The straits were narrower than the Persian admirals had accounted for. Movement became chaos. Oars tangled, hulls collided. Command signals were lost in the noise. The fleet had come to crush a trapped enemy, but now found itself trapped instead. Themistocles had baited them perfectly. The Greek ships struck with speed, darting in and out between the bulk of Persian vessels. Flaming arrows fell in arcs across the water. Rowers screamed over the crack of splintering wood. Smoke curled above the strait. Artemisia's own ship, caught between confusion and collapse, made a bold move, ramming a friendly vessel to escape the pursuit. Greek observers, mistaking her for one of their own, praised her maneuver. Xerxes, watching from the bluff, is said to have admired her cunning, unaware she had destroyed one of his own. By the time night fell, the outcome was clear. The Persian fleet had lost more ships than it could afford, and worse, it had lost the momentum. The element of awe that had carried the army across the Hellespont was broken. What had begun as a sacred act of restoration was now tangled in failure. Xerxes did not stay to argue. He had already begun to consider the broader war. His army remained enormous, but the sea had turned. Without naval control, resupply would strain, retreat routes would narrow, risk would grow. He left command to Mardonius. The army would remain in Greece, but Xerxes began preparations to return to Persia. Some said he left in shame. Others said it was prudence. But whatever his motive, one thing had changed. He was no longer cleansing rebellion. He was managing defeat. The fire he had brought across the sea did not go out, but it no longer lit the way forward. It flickered, cautious now, unsure of the winds ahead. The gods had not spoken, but the tide had, and it said, this land would not burn so easily. Xerxes had returned to Persia, but the war did not end. He left behind an army still vast, still well-equipped, still commanded by a trusted noble, Mardonius, his cousin and longtime general. Mardonius was experienced, persuasive, and confident in his ability to finish what had been started. He believed that without the burden of the king's presence, he could maneuver more freely. Perhaps he was right, but the momentum was gone. The Greeks, sensing the change, began to rally. Sparta and Athens no longer spoke only of defense. Themistocles' gamble at Salamis had paid off, and the aura of Persian invincibility had cracked. The Greek city-states, long divided by old rivalries and jealousies, now found rare cause for unity. For a moment, perhaps only one, they agreed on something. Plataea. Mardonius had hoped to isolate the Athenians from their allies. He sent envoys with promises of autonomy, wealth, and peace if they broke ranks. The Athenians refused. They had already seen their city burned, their temples destroyed. There would be no bargain. What followed was not a single glorious clash. It was a slow unraveling, a campaign marked by feints, delayed maneuvers, and weeks of uncertainty. The two sides camped near Plataea, watching each other across the fields, probing, adjusting, waiting. Persian cavalry raids disrupted Greek supply lines. Greek infantry refused to be lured into the open. Neither side wanted to strike first. The tension built. Summer passed into early autumn. Then the lines broke, not through strategy, but confusion. A shift in camp positions, misread by Mardonius, led to a sudden and fragmented Persian advance. The Greeks responded unevenly, but their phalanx formations held. When Mardonius fell in battle, struck down while leading his elite cavalry, the Persian lines began to falter. Without clear command, the army collapsed in waves. It was not a massacre, but a retreat that turned to rout. By the end, the Persian dead covered the plains. The survivors fled north, abandoning what was left of their hopes in Greece. The dream of bringing the Hellenes into the empire, not by chains, but by divine order, dissolved into dust. In Persia, Xerxes continued to rule, to build, to pass judgment. But the ambition that had once stretched across the sea, that had moved mountains and bent rivers, had been extinguished, not by Spartan swords, not by Athenian courage, but by time, by hunger, by distance. The empire was too large to fall, but too slow to hold what it could not understand. And so the war ended not in fire, but in absence. Plataea was no coronation for the Greeks, nor a cataclysm for the Persians. It was a long breath released, a war that should not have been finally allowed to die. The palace at Persepolis no longer echoed with the sounds of war. The march of boots, the hammer of chariot wheels, the recitation of omens, all of it faded. In its place came a quieter rhythm, scrolls unrolling in council, the shuffle of petitioners' robes across polished stone, the low voices of ministers calculating grain tallies and marriage alliances. The empire had contracted, drawn inward like a breath held too long, and at the center of it all, unmoving, unreadable, sat the King of Kings. Xerxes resumed the throne as if he had never left it, cloaked in the ceremonial stillness that now defined his rule. But those who had served him before noticed the difference. His temper, once measured and cold, began to show flashes of heat. Some said he had grown harsher in his judgments. Others claimed he now trusted fewer voices. At court, the nobles did not speak of Greece, not because it was forbidden, but because it was no longer necessary. Whatever had burned, there had burned out. But ambition, once sparked, never truly dies. The court around Xerxes began to shift. Advisors who had risen during the Greek campaign now found themselves competing for influence against satraps from the east. The military faction, led by survivors of Plataea and Salamis, lost ground to the priestly class and civil administrators. Old alliances strained, new ones formed behind drawn curtains. The queen, a mistress, once content to move through the palace like shadow, began to assert herself more openly. Her son, Artaxerxes, was now of age, and with every passing season, whispers grew louder, about succession, about loyalty, about legacy. Artabanus, head of the royal guard, grew more powerful with each passing moon. He had been at Xerxes' side for years, guarding the inner court, observing every change in the king's posture. Some believed he was loyal beyond question. Others believed he was patient beyond belief. He controlled access to the king's chamber. He advised on matters of security and punishment. And most importantly, he was not bound by blood. Within the grand halls of Persepolis, decisions were no longer made by proclamation, but by suggestion. A word here, a silence there. Ministers avoided eye contact when questioned. Priests clutched their fire talismans more tightly before council meetings. Royal scribes began to notice that certain names no longer appeared on invitation rolls. Some fell ill. Others simply disappeared. Xerxes, for his part, did not retreat. He oversaw temple expansions, summoned artisans to complete the unfinished carvings at Persepolis, and reviewed petitions from distant satrapies. But his inner circle narrowed. He rarely left the capital. When he walked the palace gardens flanked by guards, he seemed not at peace, but waiting, always waiting. Some say he feared a shadow. Others say he was following one. And all the while, behind the marble and incense and careful choreography of court ritual, a crack had formed, not in the empire, in the room, the kind of crack that lets whispers pass. The palace slept lightly that night. Wind moved through the gardens of Persepolis in slow gusts, stirring the dry cypress leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a bronze chime rang once, then silence. The guards at the western colonnade shifted their stance, spears angled toward the moon. Inside the private quarters of the king, lamps burned low. The scent of sandalwood curled beneath the heavy drapes. No one would ever agree on the exact hour. Some said the chief of the royal guard, Artabanus, entered first, alone, that he passed through the inner gates with a seal he had always carried. Others claimed there were footsteps before his, servants in white robes, a young eunuch with trembling hands, a priest whispering words not found in the Avesta. Still others insist it wasn't Artabanus at all, that the true killer wore no uniform, bore no title, and left no name. What is certain is that when the sun rose on the palace that morning, Xerxes was dead. They found his body just before dawn, draped across the edge of the dais in his private chamber. No blood on the floor, no shattered urns, just the slight tilt of his crown, fallen sideways into the folds of his robe, and the faint imprint of fingers on his throat. No struggle, no witnesses, only a king extinguished. Artabanus was the first to speak publicly. He claimed to have discovered the body himself, summoned by a strange silence in the king's quarters. He called for the royal guard, sealed the chamber, and ordered a sacred fire lit in the courtyard. But there were rumors even before the body was removed that he had entered hours earlier, that no one had seen him leave, that his voice shook, not with grief, but with something else. Some said he did it out of ambition, that he had grown too close to the levers of power, too comfortable in the corridors behind the throne. He had seen the next generation rising, Artaxerxes poised to ascend, and feared being cast aside. He was the blade that protected the king, and blades sometimes forget where their hilts end, but others looked elsewhere. Amestris, the queen, had grown formidable in her quiet years. Her son's path to succession was not guaranteed. There were other princes, other factions. To secure the future, she may have risked the present. The court had already whispered about her enemies vanishing, minor nobles exiled, a rival wife disgraced, a priest found drowned in a garden well. She moved like dusk, slowly, then all at once. If anyone had the will to act and make it seem like fate, it was her. And then there were those who suspected the Magi. The priesthood had grown uneasy under Xerxes. He had centralized their power, trimmed their land rights, redirected funds from older temples to new ones closer to court. Some whispered he had ceased the proper fire rituals for 3 nights during his mourning after Salamis, a grave omission. To the Magi, Xerxes had been a steward of Usher, but stewards could fail. Or perhaps it had been none of them. Perhaps the fire had gone out on its own, not by murder, but by silence too deep to endure. By mid-morning, the halls of Persepolis rang with morning chants. Priests gathered in the great square, firebowls lit, incense poured over the braziers. Official announcements declared the king had passed in his sleep. There was no mention of bruises, no mention of seals missing, no word on the guards who were later found reassigned or disappeared. Within days, Artaxerxes was crowned. The transition came swift and smooth. Too smooth, some thought. Artabanus knelt before the new king, pledged his loyalty, and remained at his post. The queen did not appear at the ceremony. She had already taken up residence in the western wing, behind the screens of mourning. And so it ended, not in war, nor prophecy, nor divine reckoning, but in a locked chamber and a silent hall. They say that after Xerxes died, the sacred flame at the main altar sputtered twice before steadying. A flicker, a hesitation. And some claim that when the priests relit the fire for the new reign, it did not burn as brightly as before. But perhaps that too is just a story. Xerxes died in 465 BCE. But his afterlife, the one written in books, echoed in plays, and taught in classrooms, was just beginning, and it would not be written by his own people. The image of Xerxes most familiar to the modern world does not come from Persian sources. It comes from the pens of his enemies. Greek historians, especially Herodotus, became the narrators of his reign, and they did not write kindly. In their hands, Xerxes became a caricature, a tyrant wrapped in gold, a megalomaniac who lashed the sea and wept when he realized his army would someday die. He was not remembered as a ruler or a reformer, but as a villain in a national epic. This transformation was not accidental. The Greco-Persian Wars marked a moment of profound identity formation for the Greek world, particularly Athens. In resisting Persia, the Greek polis constructed a shared myth of themselves as defenders of freedom against an overwhelming Eastern despotism. For that myth to endure, Xerxes had to serve as its foil. He became not a human being, but a symbol of arrogance, excess, and failed empire. Herodotus, writing a generation later, blends fact with theatre. His histories are full of dialogue he could not have witnessed, dreams and portents treated as real, and a tendency to attribute motivation without evidence. He tells of Xerxes whipping the sea for destroying his bridges, a moment often cited as proof of madness. Yet Persian records make no mention of this. The act may have happened, or it may be metaphor twisted into anecdote. Either way, the framing belongs to Greece. Persian inscriptions tell a different story. In the surviving texts from Persepolis, Xerxes speaks of restoring order, punishing rebellion, and protecting the truth of Ahura Mazda. His proclamations are bureaucratic, measured, and saturated with the language of cosmic responsibility. There is no boasting, no references to theatrical cruelty. The tone is calm, official, and sacred. These inscriptions, however, were not exported. They remained carved into the stone of royal complexes, unread by the wider world. And so the narrative dominance of Greece was ensured, at least in the West, not just because of military survival, but because of literary survival. The Greeks wrote in alphabets that spread. They founded colonies with theatres, forums, and schools. Their texts were copied by the Romans, later by Byzantine monks, then by Enlightenment scholars. The Persian archives, by contrast, lay buried in ruins. Many of their scrolls decayed, or were lost in fire and time. Even the Old Persian language remained unreadable to the West until the 19th century. This imbalance shaped the image of Xerxes for millennia. In European art, he appears grotesque and decadent. In popular culture, he becomes a monster, gilded, pierced, screaming. Films depict him not as a ruler of a sophisticated empire, but as a godless tyrant drawn from nightmare. The real man, the one who oversaw the world's largest administrative state, who ruled from India to Thrace, who understood law in 3 languages and kept silence as policy, vanishes. And yet, some things endure. In the ruins of Persepolis, his name remains. In trilingual inscriptions etched into limestone, Xerxes calls himself King of Kings, King of Countries, son of Darius the King. He lists the provinces he ruled, from Gandhara to Lydia, from Egypt to Bactria, and offers prayers not to himself, but to Ahura Mazda. The words are not elaborate, but they are precise, and they are his. So when we ask who Xerxes was, we must also ask, who wrote the question, and who answered first? The memory of kings does not live in their wars alone. It lives in who gets to speak when the dust has settled. And for Xerxes, the dust was thick, and the speakers were not his own. The death of Xerxes did not shatter the empire. The roads still carried messages. The satrapies still paid their tribute. The fire altars still burned. On the surface, Persia endured. But within the palace, something shifted. Artaxerxes, his son, took the throne amid blood and whispers. His ascension had not been clean. Some claimed he was installed by those who killed his father. Others said he struck the first blow himself. The truth was buried with the bodies. What followed was a quiet dislocation. Authority remained intact, but its roots began to loosen. The court grew more dangerous. Assassinations, purges, disappearances, none of them new, but all more frequent. The center no longer held with stillness, but with suspicion. Across the empire, the machinery Darius had built and Xerxes had refined continued to function. But the confidence behind it, the sacred alignment, the certainty of Asher, no longer burned quite as brightly. Xerxes had ruled for 20 years. He had buried rebellion, punished insult, and bound the sea with wood and fire. But even kings who stretch the edges of the world leave seams behind. In the years that followed, the empire would grow again, and then contract. The throne would pass from hand to hand, from strong men to vain ones, from visionaries to shadows. But always the memory of Xerxes would remain, sometimes whispered, sometimes feared, and sometimes unanswered. What began with fire now moved towards silence again, but the silence was no longer sacred. It was waiting. He ruled over the greatest empire the world had known, and yet, to most who remember him, he is a silhouette, a villain in a foreign myth, a cautionary figure made of gold and arrogance. In the texts of his enemies he became grotesque, a man who whipped the sea, who reveled in excess, who burned cities only to watch them fall. But the stone of Persepolis says nothing of madness. Its walls do not scream. They show a king in perfect stillness, receiving tribute, presiding over ritual, upholding the rhythm of a world designed to endure. No threats, no boasts, just presence, just fire. Xerxes was not the first to be swallowed by the voice of the other, nor would he be the last. History, when left to victors, rarely listens to the silence it destroys, and Xerxes was a king of silence, shaped by a court that spoke in gesture, bound to a creed that saw order not as domination, but as balance. His power was not forged in performance, but in restraint. His ambition was not to be feared, but to be understood. It wasn't. His invasion became legend, but not on his terms. His laws were forgotten while his defeats were rehearsed. The sacred fire he carried became, in other hands, a symbol of delusion. And so the story turned. The man who crossed the sea to restore a pattern became the monster who defied the gods. The bearer of balance became the breaker of peace. The steward of Asher became the echo of hubris. Perhaps that is the final irony, that a king who lived to preserve memory would himself become its distortion, that a man who ruled in stillness would only be remembered through noise. But memory is never settled. Stone remains, tablets remain. So does the road, winding across desert and mountain, the same one he once walked. And if you follow it far enough, past the silence, past the smoke, you may find him again, not as the Greeks told you, not as the myths made him, but as he was, a shadow of heaven, a flame born in 2 hands, a name that still burns beneath the dust. And so the war is over, the banners lower, The footsteps fade across the stone. Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of all lands touched by the sun, slips now into shadow, not forgotten, not erased, but transformed, into legend, into silence, into the soft breath of empire remembered by stone and story, not by triumph. He was not the monster they made of him, nor the god they feared. He was a man, shaped by fire and expectation, by myth and by lineage, by love for a world that no longer understood itself. His was not a story of failure, but of distance, a distance between how one rules and how one is remembered. Perhaps you feel that distance now, that gentle ache of time settling back into itself, the sound of a history too often told by others, now reclaimed. If you are still here, still listening, then thank you for staying, for making space, for letting a forgotten voice speak again. You've walked with us through Persepolis and Thermopylae, through ceremonies and rebellions, through quiet halls where power said nothing, yet moved the world. You have heard not just the footsteps of kings, but the weight of their silence, the burden of legacy, and the echo of fire carried too long. Let us part gently, as always. Let the court grow still. Let the golden columns of the palace fade once more into night. The names, Xerxes, Darius, Cyrus, they rest now. But they are not gone. They wait in the dust of old inscriptions, in the crackle of firewood, in the quiet pause before justice is named aloud. Sleep well now. May your dreams walk royal roads, past fire temples, across quiet bridges, through gardens where history waits, not to be judged, but to be heard.